And I should probably move in much closer too.
Well, welcome everyone. Welcome to another podcast of the Cryptoscience. Today it's me and Jim Brown. Jason couldn't make it, but we might add him later to the mix. Sorry for my voice. I've got a bit of a cold. But today we're talking about Bigfoot. And our guest today is Jim Brown, who's one of our other Cryptoscience members. And he has a lot of love and fascination for Bigfoot. And so do you want to go ahead and talk about a few things about yourself, Jim, and I was kind of curious, like, what got you really interested in Bigfoot to start with, and what's your fascination with Bigfoot?
Well, okay, for starters, let me just say, Jason at one point referred to me as like a resident sage or something like that. And I just have to say that really my only claim to fame is that I hang around some people who really are. I'm just sort of a hanger-oner. They all have their own research sites and stuff like that, and I don't have enough money to pay for the gas to go have my own research site, to find a good place. But that being said, I've gone out with a lot of these folks who've done and seen wonderful things, and I've seen some, very strange things. A 19-inch footprint, barefoot footprint outside my tent. Wood knocks coming from deep in the woods in the middle of the night, that sort of thing. But I've known about, the whole Bigfoot thing since, I was really young. But it really wasn't until I got to think. I saw a newspaper article one time. It was from the Aspen paper, and the woman in this article, I actually knew her by reputation, at least, and several people in my wife's milieu knew her, and where she talked about seeing a Bigfoot at close quarters, like from 12 feet away. She comes out of her tent, and she's sitting there standing face to face with Mom and a young one, and you can't really make the claim that it was a bear, because this woman also happened to have worked at a bear rescue. So she knows bears. And so I got to looking for that article again, and I came across the BFRO website and started looking at that and reading a lot of those stories, and swore I'd never go into the woods again. And so just from there, then I met Michael Johnson, who runs a group locally called Sasquatch Investigation of the Rockies. And he and many of the people in the group are the ones that I have learned, the most from, and we go out frequently, fairly frequently. So anyway, that's in a nutshell how I got there.
Oh, awesome. Yeah, in terms of my experience with Bigfoot, I think Jason and Jim have a lot more experience and research. I'm just sort of like, that's interesting. Which is why I really appreciated the article that you posted recently. One of my favorite lines was, and I think I've mentioned it in a previous podcast, that idea of, facts lead to truth, or, sometimes we'll edit this part out because I've just started getting rambling, but just sort of the idea of the totality of evidence. And so someone who's skeptic like me is really starting to really consider sort of well, it's really interesting that there's all this evidence. What do you think is the biggest reason why people are so unwilling to think of Bigfoot as a possible real phenomenon?
I think it's just habit, really, and laziness. I also said in that article too, I just don't necessarily want to be quoting myself, but I will.
Go for it.
People, I welcome a skeptic, very much so. A skeptic will ask penetrating questions and make me think about what I'm saying. But, the skepticism and cynicism are not the same thing. And I think most people just fall into cynical mode, so they don't really have to think about any possibilities. It's like I used to tell my kids when they were younger. I said, when you answer my questions, don't give me some sort of predigested sentence. Make it your own. Tell me what you're thinking. And I think cynics just get these predigested ideas because it's easier. They don't have to really learn anything. It's computer graphics. If they knew we put involved, what was computer graphics, they wouldn't say that. It's a guy in a monkey suit, which is just really unbelievably stupid if you stop and think about it. But I just think people just dismiss it because it's easier. It's outside of their worldview.
Yeah, and I think and I could especially expound from my cynical perspective too sometimes, and kind of really starting to try to kind of work with that and kind of be a bit more open to the evidence, is that sometimes it's like certain phenomenon sound so foreign or alien and odd that it's really hard to kind of put that there, especially as like it's easier to think, there's this alien from outer space coming and visiting us. Why that's easier to understand than something that might be more terrestrial is rather hard, especially when we talk about like how of a global society we are and like the technology that we have. It can be really hard to think that, and maybe some like conceit involved with humans in terms of like, well, how could there be something that's potentially as intelligent as I who's evaded like human interaction? And so I think that's been like a really interesting thing to kind of deconstruct and think through and really start to kind of like, well, what is the evidence? And so in terms of kind of like what you have researched and looked at in these expeditions, what are some of like the key pieces of like evidence that really point to this phenomenon?
Well, the footprint that I mentioned, I mean, that was kind of a game changer. I went from being pretty skeptical to say, okay, there's something out there. And, again, hearing the wood knocks, if this was in late October or early November, so it was pitch black, it was colder than, well, it was cold. And, and to hear these wood knocks coming from deep in the woods. And, I mean, this was not just tap. I mean, this was, the impact, say, of a baseball bat, from a professional player or something. You could just tell there was power behind those. Those definitely woke me up. And there's a lot of other things. There's the structures that people talk about a lot. You see, that's where I'll back off a little bit and be a little bit more skeptical. And we can talk more about the wood structures in a moment, but to the best of my knowledge, nobody's ever seen a Bigfoot constructing these things. But yet they are definitely associated in everybody's who does this in everybody's mind with Bigfoot. Mm-hmm. They seem to occur in areas where there are a lot of reports. There's just this sense of, well, what else could do it? It's not an elk and it's not a deer or a bear or anything like that. So what could be making these structures? And by structures, I mean, like, imagine getting, a 2 or 3 inch sapling, bending it over without breaking it, jamming the tip of it 6 inches into the ground, which takes massive power. Interleaving pieces and sticking a piece in there that's like a keystone, mm-hmm. that holds it all together. It was obviously done by something intelligent. And there's just no reason in the world to think that it was humans, because many of these, you find them, they're old. So you have these structures, like I said, people associate with them, but I don't know that's ever been proven, even demonstrated, that they actually do this. But there's some crazy stuff. My son went out with me one day. He said, "Dad, I thought you were kind of nuts," until I went out and looked at all those things and wandering around in the woods and looking at these things. I said, "Dad, that's crazy."
So it's kind of like that interesting sort of like you hear about it, and then when you really see it, there's like a difference that happens. It's like one thing to hear about it and be described it, and then to be kind of faced with these structures. Have people ever tried to mimic these structures, like kind of move these saplings or create these structures to see if humans can do it?
I think people have, and that's one of the fears now that we have now that's hit in the popular culture so much, that people may be going out there trying to do these as a hoax. The and people have tried it, and it's not that easy. Actually, to bend a small tree over and not break it, it takes a little bit of doing. And just a lot of it takes a lot of power. Sometimes it's like fairly large trees that are not in place. They've got a root ball, but there's no hole there where the root ball was. And there's just an infinite variation on these.
Right.
Although people kind of call them X's or and TPs, and some of these sorts of things, just sort of so that we can talk about them. A's.
Well, that's kind of interesting you talk about structures, because sometimes I think about crop circles. And what's fascinating about those is, like, yes, humans can replicate them and do them, but what's fascinating is that they can still produce the same sort of electromagnetic results from doing it. And so it's just sort of, humans might be able to mimic in some sort of way, but that doesn't necessarily discount that it could be also happening with other intelligent creatures or entities behind it as well. So it's kind of one of those things that can be hard to tease apart, like what's authentic and what's not. But that's not necessarily, like, important. It's kind of like we keep seeing it happen. That seems to be, like, a reoccurring pieces of evidence every time somebody goes out to investigate Bigfoot.
And there are a lot. I could think of 2 areas just right off the top of my head where the woods are just littered with these things. And the question kind of becomes, why?
Yeah.
If you try to put yourself in the mind of a Bigfoot, which is not easy, what could possibly be the purpose behind all of this? And maybe they do it just for fun. I don't know. And sometimes you see great big ones. Sometimes you see little ones, and you think, well, the little kids have to learn somehow too.
Yeah.
Maybe sometimes it's juveniles learning how to do it. You just they are so alien. And I don't, in the sense, that foreign to us, that it really is kind of, I think, pointless to try to put yourself in their head too much.
Well, it's kind of like trying to put yourself in, like, an ancient civilization and try to, like, we're still understanding it from our own perspective and, like, how we move and navigate through the world.
Yeah, exactly. And, there's the basic emotions, fear, anger, and from what people's experiences are, those are generally not hard to recognize in these creatures. But, as to why they would put these up, sometimes it seems like they might be marking a pathway. Tree breaks are very common. Something about 5 or 6 feet off the ground, a 2 or 3 inch tree snapped, but not snapped loose. And sometimes they're very fresh, and the wood is still as white as it can be.
Mm-hmm.
An average person just can't do that. Just can't reach up that high and break a tree. And we always try to watch, what's the weather? Where are the winds coming from? Are there others? Is it snow load? Is it, is it any number of things? And we try to weed those out before we say, yes, this looks like a legitimate structure. Because that's always one of the first questions, is it snow load?
Yeah. Well, in terms of, like, because also talking about, like, wood knocks, rock throwing and whatnot, but in terms of geographics and kind of, like, reports and stuff, what are some common, like, places that, because it's, like, all over the world as far as I know, but what are some concentrated, because Jason and I went up to, I forget what town it was, but it was a Bigfoot outpost just to kind of see it.
Oh, yeah, up in Bailey, yeah.
Yeah, up in Bailey. Which I thought was kind of like a cool gimmick, but really fascinating at the same time. It was like a little mini museum. Pretty good thought put into it as well. So if you're ever traveling in Colorado, go visit it. It's fun. But they had like this whole map of like Colorado and kind of like different pins and stuff, and like people reporting kind of where they've seen Bigfoot. So I thought it was like really fascinating.
That is. It really is. And they I'll hang tight here for a minute.
Pause for nose blowing. Sorry, everyone. We can hopefully edit that out. But talk about this cold that's been going around. Jeez, it's like holding on to everyone. Okay, yeah.
So we were talking about clusters, and there are a lot of reports in the Front Range area, up around Bailey and that part. One of our fellows saw one up there and saw footprints in the snow. It was late spring. I have heard stories of the cadets down at the Air Force Academy. There used to be one of the creatures that would sit up there and watch them out there as they were doing PT, and he was just called the Watcher. Mm-hmm. And they all knew of him. He was just sort of a fixture. He or she, was kind of a fixture. There was an incident a year or two ago where somebody came face to face with one of them on one of the trails. I can't think which one of the open spaces it was, but it just seemed to be standing there saying, don't go any further. And people generally believe them when they say that or something like that, or when they're standing there looking imposing.
Yeah.
People generally go along with whatever. But there's clusters. I mean, North Carolina has a lot. If you look at the BFRO maps, Ohio, I think, of course, California and Oregon.
Yeah, and funny thing with Oregon is that it's considered unofficial on its wildlife reserve list. So, and it's not even a campy sort of thing. It's just like Bigfoot is on its website.
Mm-hmm. There's somebody sent me a sign the other day that they took at the Kootenai, however you say that, National Forest, and it's saying, watch out for Bigfoots. If you see a Bigfoot, don't approach it, don't chase it, don't do this and that, but do get a picture. But this is a Forest Service thing. Somebody sent me a page from an older U.S. Army training manual from up in Washington, and where it was listing wildlife to be seen, and it listed Sasquatches. Huh. So, what do you do with that?
Well, and that's also interesting too, in terms of like the thing that Jason and I found interesting while we were up in Bailey was we just ended up at this like little cafe because we wanted some coffee before heading back. And, naturally Jason's just like, hey, tell me more. He's really good at just kind of like, but a lot of times people who are like living mountain people and like have lived in the mountains all the time, have like a very sort of big connection to kind of what's happening in the woods and hunting and different things like that. It's always like this really casual, like, something weird happened. I don't know what it was, but I'm not going to mess with it kind of thing. And I always think that that's like a really interesting approach to have to different things that we might not necessarily have enough data on. It's just sort of, it could be Bigfoot. It's something. All I know is that the birds all went silent, so it's like time to get out of there.
And just as an aside there real quick, one of the things that we learned is listen for the crows and listen for the squirrels.
Huh.
The squirrels, I think, are just, they see something big moving through the woods like that, and they're just chattering and screaming and fussing.
Uh-huh.
I guess that's what squirrels do. And the crow, a little bit of carrot, a little bit of, some leftovers or something. So there is that idea of watch the wildlife and listen to the wildlife and see what they're doing.
Yeah.
But you're exactly right. People will say but not really say, which in many ways is I think is the best approach. I mean, we can't say with very few exceptions, a Bigfoot or a Sasquatch did this. We can say, according to what we think we know, mm-hmm. it appears that something that we think does like this did this. That doesn't make any sense at all, I don't think.
No, I think it was clear what you were meaning.
you can say, okay, you find a 1,000-pound tree stump turned upside down and jammed in the ground. You say, well, it wasn't a squirrel, and it wasn't a mountain lion, or go down the whole list. Well, what did it then? Well, according to what we think we know about these creatures, it may have been. That's the best guess.
Right.
But you have to be really careful, and I'm always fussing at our people at one time or another. You'll say, well, what is this or this, so it must be a Bigfoot.
Yeah. But it's still that evidence in itself is just really fascinating.
Well, and that's, so it was, I couldn't remember the name at the time, but it was Cliff Barackman, who's the one who brought that up at a conference. And he was on Finding Bigfoot. But he is and actually, all those guys actually are very serious researchers, and almost walked off the show when they found that one of the producers or somebody was playing fast and loose with the evidence. So they're serious dudes.
Yeah.
But Cliff Barackman is a scientist in his own right and approaches it scientifically. And he has seen footprints and handprints, from California to Kentucky to China. Well, where they say, oh, do you have these in America too?
And I think that would be the next big segue into because you know a lot about the footprints and the handprints and things like that. I think that's some really fascinating evidence, because talking about the mechanics and the anatomy of that stuff.
Well, so let me just start by saying you could cut out the shape of a Bigfoot and strap it to somebody's foot and have them walk around. And to a tracker, somebody knows what they're looking at, they would not be fooled for a second. Because humans push off with their toe. And if you look at a footprint in the sand, that sounds almost like a poem, doesn't it? But you'll see the little mound of dirt behind the toes where they push off with the toe. And in these other footprints they find, the mound is halfway through the foot, as if the foot is flexing there in the middle. They call it the mid-tarsal break. So a human couldn't even fake it, really. And something, I think it was also Cliff Barackman who said, a footprint is not necessarily just an impression of the foot in the ground. A footprint is a record of the interaction between that creature's foot and the substrate. Which is a very, very important distinction. This ground was a little softer. It gave a little more. It was a little sandier. The foot may have slid at this point. And that's all vitally important stuff if you're trying to read these as a tracker. And so and one of the classic sets is from the famous Patterson-Gimlin film, which is the one that you always see, where they went back, and within a few days they had photographed and cast it's either 10 or 16 footprints. I can't remember exactly. But either way, a lot of footprints. And they were all different. They all had interactions with the ground. And there's a very distinctive walk, one foot in front of the other. It's called a compliant gait. Plus the fact that they were 14 inches long and 72 inches apart. You really can't say that these guys were out there faking it. They just couldn't fake that.
Right.
To think of these guys, who are smart guys, and I've met Bob Gimlin. He's a smart guy and a wonderfully dirty old man too, if I may say so. He just won my heart. But but they're not smart enough to create a whole new anatomy. That takes a lot of doing.
It's kind of like one of those things. It's like the amount of effort and energy, time and money to hoax something is greater than the fact that it maybe is just real. So it's kind of like, why would somebody put so much effort into that? Just to create this thing.
I think you're exactly right. Now, people will bring up the fact that Bob Patterson, he desperately wanted to get this footage of a Bigfoot. And he wanted to get rich from it. And he, I mean, it's possible, people talk about a suit, that was made and this sort of stuff. Nobody's ever really come up with it. They say they have, but not really. What they've got doesn't look like anything. But when you look at this creature and he may have come prepared to hoax, but he didn't have to. It turns out he saw, saw the real thing. The walk. I just read something the other day that it finally clicked on me. You watch this creature walk in the film. His trailing leg bends 90 degrees. Human beings don't flex their leg that they're extending forward 90 degrees. They just don't walk like that. Mm-hmm. And it goes 90 degrees, and it's like he thrusts his knee up, and then his foot lands, and his leg is still bent when it hits the ground. So it's never fully straightening, and it's very hard, if not impossible, to duplicate. I've tried it, when no one's around, because I don't want to be seen trying it. But it's a whole new way of walking. Mm-hmm. And who would have, two ranchers from Yakima, Washington, are probably not going to come up with this.
Right. Well, and it's too bad Jason can't tell about some of his interesting experiences as a kid in the Roaring Fork Valley. But in terms of because the other thing is the wood knocks and the whooping mm-hmm. as pieces of evidence. I know you said you had experience with wood knocks. Did you have experiences with this vocalizations?
I don't think so.
Okay.
There's nothing that I would say even feel remotely confident in saying so. But from people who have talked about it, I'm going to backtrack for a second. I saw a video one time of a fox, and it's just sitting there looking at the camera, and then suddenly it just screams, and it made me jump out of my skin, And so there are creatures in the woods that do screams and stuff like this, and make noises kind of like that. But one of the things I've heard is that it is so visceral. Mm-hmm. It is so loud that you feel it in your body. When they grunt or when they, or yell or do different things. And that's a whole different ball game to have that kind of impact on you.
Yeah, sort of and just sort of the fun, the sound phenomenon associated with it, in terms of just sort of, because I one of the things that I've heard, just kind of being a passive listener of this phenomenon, in evidence and stuff, is sort of the idea of sound interacting with people's emotions, or Bigfoot being able to have such an impact on people's emotions, hey, get out of here, being really fearful and then getting out of there, or just sort of having that interaction between their sounds and sort of what a human's going to feel based off of it.
And I think you're exactly right. And part of it is just plain old common sense. If something's growling at you,
right? You get out of there.
You're going to run. It's always a good idea. But the fact that sometimes people just feel such utter terror. When a story one of the people in our group talks about, way back when, he was a long-range reconnaissance fellow in Vietnam. Uh-huh. These are the guys who went into Laos and Cambodia when we weren't there. And, these guys are tough. Toughest of the tough. And he was on a hunting trip in Wyoming. He was with some other of his buddies. And they saw this something, and they looked at it through a scope, and it was looking back at them. And said it terrified them all so much they didn't drop their weapons. They took their weapons, but they jumped in the truck and they got out of they left their camp. Just something about it was so terrifying that he said we were big, strapping young men, and we weren't afraid of anything. We saw that. And I hear that story a lot. People will be chasing something, and then they just stop and freeze and just say, I'm not going any further.
Yeah. Which is, so it could be different. Like, I think sometimes humans have gotten so far away from, woods and, like, interacting with that kind of aspect of nature. So sometimes those reactions that are so, like, ingrained or primal, we're not necessarily aware of. Because, that idea we can feel something watching us when it's not, and that we can't see, kind of thing. Like, people have done experiments. If, like, you stare at somebody's back, they can, like, feel it.
I think that's a really good point. And, oh shoot, I forgot what I was going to say. You don't want to repeat all that by any chance, do you? To help me remember.
Oh, yeah, totally. So just sort of like...
No, I'm teasing you.
Oh, okay.
But, yeah. Well, I know what I was going to say. Is that there is this idea that perhaps they use infrasound.
Yeah.
The elephants can do that. Those long wavelengths can go for miles. And that perhaps, and it can have huge impacts. Infrasound can have crazy impacts on your emotions. And again, this is speculation. But just from the stories people tell, I think every group out there has a name for this phenomenon. We call it being sizzled. But where just something happens and you find yourself sick and throwing up. Just all of a sudden you just get sick and start throwing up. Or just being terrified. We've speculated that, maybe if you do something that has displeased them, they can chase you out or chase you away or do something with this just to hit you so hard that you go home.
Yeah.
And again, every group out there are a lot of groups. I imagine every state probably has at least one Bigfoot group.
Yeah, kind of like MUFON.
Yeah, exactly. But not MUFON.org, right? That's a different one. Huh?
Yeah, they're UFO phenomenons. Yeah, the Mutual UFO Network.
Just teasing, yes.
Oh, got it.
I've hung around Jason enough now. I know them now. But they seem to all have some kind of name for this phenomenon. So again, something's happening all over the country, at various times to people. So again, it's congruence of evidence, like like Cliff Brockman was talking about. People who were probably not in contact with each other, or at least not way back when. They might be now, but it's just interesting to me that so many different groups just talk about a lot of the same phenomena. And there's analogs for a lot of this stuff in nature. There's other creatures that do infrasound. There's creatures who can see up into the infrared, and any kind of night creature probably can see into the infrared, which is one of the reasons probably the camera traps don't work very often, because they can see the infrared beams.
Mm-hmm.
And I've speculated before that maybe that's why people say it's like it can read my mind. I hear it outside my tent, and as soon as I reach for my recorder, it's gone. Well, if they can see into the infrared, perhaps they can see you through, your heat signature through the tent and see you reaching for something, and that's their signal to get out of there.
Well, that's kind of a cool thought too, because a lot of times I think one thing that we do intellectually too is then we kind of go the route of like magic, and sorry, I was like trying to and instead it might be some sort of biological mechanism. that is actually more relatable to a lot of species that can do different things. So it'd be like maybe they can't necessarily read minds, but they're perceptive in other ways that it can extrapolate certain information. Um, which I think is really, really fascinating. So maybe as our tech gets a little bit easier to disguise, like like a pen camera or something like that, maybe that evidence would be easier. But I also find it interesting. I know this is kind of a tangent or a side, but just thinking about capturing evidence in general. One thing that I find really interesting is that as our technology has advanced, it's easier to hoax and easier to catch information, and as a result, it's harder to extrapolate what is authentic and not. Because so many people can use the excuse, well, you can use this, this, and this to create something. So there's so many times where I'll come across evidence and be like, because of that skeptic brain, because we can deconstruct so much stuff, you even have a more of a need and necessity to really kind of take apart that evidence and look at it and really show that hey, yeah, this thing can be faked, but it also, you can't really fake it in this way. And being more mindful of kind of the evidence coming through in general.
And that's it. There's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of videos out there, and there's probably maybe 30 that I would give much credence to, because you just have to, as you say, pick them apart and just kind of, does it just look real? Does it feel real? Does it look like a guy in a monkey suit? And as I pointed out in my article, you're probably not going to have much success wearing a monkey suit and running through the woods.
Right.
Big old feet and a helmet that you can't see with. If it's running through the woods, that gets a lot more credibility in my book. But the proportions are, you have to just kind of look at the proportions, look at the shoulder, look at the quality of the fur or the hair. Does it look real, or does it look like a polyester,
just sort of fake thing
jacket? But you're right. The technology for hoaxing is getting so good. So you have to be extra careful. There's a very good guy. I highly recommend listening to it. Go to his YouTube videos. He calls himself Thinker Thunker.
Thinker Thunker?
Yes, and he will get these videos and he will deconstruct them. He's got all kinds of awesome little video capability. He can loop things, and he'll get something and then move it into the background, to compare heights, and does all this stuff. And he's not cynical, but he's skeptical.
Right.
But generally, the videos he looks at, he says, this is real. There's something here. Of course, I think part of that because he only chooses the best ones, because there's a lot of crap.
Well, and especially too, there's a lot of crap that you can I was just watching this other guy. He's an engineer and makes things on YouTube. Is pretty cool. And so, he was they were deconstructing a couple of videos, just of things of you can't actually do that with an iPhone, or they were trying to make a phone droid, not a droid, the thing that flies. Yeah, they're droids. They're droids. It doesn't work, and gimmicky, just kind of based on sort of shadows and different things like that. So there's some very quickly you can throw out a lot, but those ones that you're just those are the ones that are good to examine.
That's it, and there's a good many of them that are just I think there's one 28 of the best videos, except for the one of the creature in Russia. I think it was the second or third one in that video. I don't believe for a second. That one didn't look the least bit real to me.
So 23 of the best, 28 of the best?
28 of the best videos. And then there's other random ones on top of that. There's the Freeman video, which I'm not sure if it was in that list or not, but where he catches this thing running through the woods, and he catches several good glimpses of it with the camera. There's the Memorial Day footage of it running down, a hillside. And then there's the 4th of July footage. which is extraordinary. It's something that appears to come out from behind a rock and pick up a baby
Wow.
and walk off. And it really doesn't seem to give two farts in a whirlwind about the guy sitting there with the camera.
Mm-hmm.
And there's just a lot of really good footage that's good enough to make you say, wow, that might be something.
Yeah.
That might be legit. And then, of course, there's the funny ones where nobody really intends for you to take it seriously. A Bigfoot in my backyard, and a guy in a monkey suit sitting there, prancing and, doing pirouettes and stuff in the backyard. I'm sorry, that makes me laugh.
Well, and those are good.
I'm shallow.
No, I think what's kind of cool, though, those are really good as well, too, because then you have something that's clearly funny and a hoax. Mm-hmm. And so that's still, like, a good thing that you can compare and contrast with. Like, here's
that's
this
thing.
That's a very
good point.
And then you can have, like, a foundation from which you analyze your evidence, especially if it's video.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I hadn't thought of that. I just thought about it because it made me laugh.
But we always need the things that make us laugh. Even like the alien videos and things like that, or some people do some really funny things.
Oh yeah. But I never thought from that perspective that it gives you actually a baseline for comparison. No, that's good.
Well, we actually ended up getting to a good 45 minutes. Do you have any rounding, ending thoughts on Bigfoot or things that you find really fascinating and interesting you'd like other people to know about?
Well, one of the questions that I would like input into this one, actually. The question we get asked so often, what are you going to do if you find it?
Yeah.
If I got, the Zapruder film of Bigfoot or something, better than that, great footage from two different angles of a Bigfoot wading in the water and moving boulders, what would you do with it? And and that's a great question, because if you prove that they were there, the woods would be overrun with people out there trying to shoot them.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it's kind of like, do they need to be found?
Exactly. And more, we're just foregoing the cameras and stuff, and we're just sitting there doing what we can to get them into camp or something, and just to see it, just to experience them. And the friends about who have seen them and actually have interacted with them to some degree just say, being in the presence of something that huge, that powerful, that magnificent is worth every bit of effort I've ever put into it. Mm-hmm. And I would love that. So if I got that footage, I might show it one time, invite all my friends, especially the skeptics and the ones who laugh at me. Yeah. Show it one time and then lock it away. But then here's the other part. All right, if you did prove it was there, then perhaps you could get it on an endangered species list. You could protect its habitat.
Well, and it's also sort of and then it kind of creates this question of first contact too. Especially if it is what we considered, quote unquote, an intelligent, interactive species. Is it a creature? Does it go on an endangered list, or does it have autonomy in terms of social structure? And then how do we interact with something like that?
And it has been, I think they definitely have language, so I think they are definitely sentient creatures. One of Michael Johnson I mentioned earlier had one standing outside of his tent, or something standing outside of his tent one night. Sounded like it was just speaking in Japanese or something.
Yeah, so it's like a tonal language.
And it repeated itself, And there's the famous Moorhead recordings, the Sierra recordings.
Yeah, those are fascinating.
Those are amazing, and they've been analyzed by a linguist, I forget his name, from the University of Wyoming, who I think was a military linguist, who said this is language, and you can tell by the repetition of sounds as much as anything else. He says this is language and it has syntax. So, I just want to experience it, and more, that's really all I'm looking for.
Yeah, and I think
By the
that's
same token, I would like to prove.
yeah. Well, I think that's kind of like what, and that I think that's kind of a beautiful thing to end this podcast on, because I think in general, I think any of us who are like in a crypto science society or exploring a lot of phenomenon, especially our group, it's more of like, well, I'm more curious about that experience rather than like the proving. Like we don't feel the need to prove anymore or to take that apart. That would be nice. That'd be great. But more than anything, it's just kind of taking that collection of data and just kind of like maybe having a more concrete experience around it. And something, and something that we can like, this happened. That's really interesting. Tell a couple of people, get on with our daily lives.
Mhm. I think that's a very good way to look at it. And I always joke, now, UFOs and Bigfoots, I'm cool with. Ghosts and stuff like that, no. That scares me. But I always say I want to see a Bigfoot or I want to see a UFO, but then I also know that I might end up screaming for the rest of my life.
That's so true. And I think that would be like a cool thing to kind of talk about in another podcast as a group, is just sort of the things that we're like want to interact with and why, and other things we don't, like the different things that plays on our sort of curiosity, and then what kind of plays on our fears would I think be really fascinating.
Yes, absolutely. I want to see a UFO. I don't want to see an alien.
Right. Yeah, like I'd say, like I don't want to. No, I'm always sort of like I'm not the person you make contact with. Well, I'm gonna go ahead and end the recording there. I think thank you so much for coming and doing this podcast. It was really great. And then, yeah, well, have a lovely day, everyone. So